I will say a huge welcome now to our two additional panelists that have joined us. MKAI community will know David Woods very well, but I'll ask you, David, to say a few words in a second to remind us of who you are. And Divya, again, I keep putting your fantastic book up there. I've got the lovely hardback, and the cover is just beautiful, and the light that bounces off it. And there's a huge amount of work that went into writing that. Very, very well received novel, and you are most welcome. David, back with you. Just very quickly, say a few words about yourself, if you would, please.
So, a fascinating discussion already, Richard. I hope we can build on that. I'll start a little bit of echoing what Tanya said. She mentioned that who would have imagined how smartphones would have changed the world? She said 20 years ago, nobody imagined such a future. Well, excuse me, 20 years ago, I actually did write an essay, which I've posted into the chat now, which predicted that although there were less than 1 million such devices at that time, there would be 100 million in use by 2007. And that's a reasonably good forecast. So I was in the early days of the smartphone and mobile phone industry as a software technologist and researcher for 25 years. I have 4 years experience as a philosopher of science as well. My background includes mathematics, but since 2008, I've been chairing London Futurists, which is a kind of a similar organization of a sort to MKAI. MKAI AI has links all over the world from its origin in Milton Keynes. London Futurist has links all over the world. We've had 300 nearly public meetings discussing exactly the same sort of thing we're discussing today. What are the technological possibilities? What are the social implications? What do we have to do differently to ensure that we don't have lots of people left behind and we end up building a terrible future? So that's a little bit about me, and I look forward to joining this discussion.
David, thank you so much. It's great to have you back here again. Divya, welcome. Please share a little bit about yourself.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Yeah, fascinating and wonderful discussion so far. A little bit about me. I started out in physics and computational neuroscience and then became an engineer. I've worked in pattern recognition, machine intelligence, high-speed digital communications, and semiconductors. And about 8 years ago, I decided to take my long deferred dream of writing science fiction and try to make it a reality. And so I started in short stories, had some publications in various magazines. I have a short novel that came out about 5 years ago. And my first novel, which Richard is so kindly showing off for all of you, Machinehood, came out about 6 months ago, earlier this year. And it really captures a lot of the thinking I've done in the last few years about artificial intelligence, about cybernetics and biotechnology, and where we might go in the rest of this century and how we might address some of these issues that we've already been discussing today, including labor, education, and the digital divide. And so I'm happy to be here and chat more about these very pressing topics and how humanity can envision its future.
You're very, very welcome, and thank you for being here. Helen put her camera back on, so I brought her back into the panel. If Andy or Tanya wants to do the same, I'll be glad to put you back on the screen, of course. Divya, you purposely carve out huge amounts of time in your working days to think, to really think. Something a lot of us maybe wish we did a bit more of. Is there an art to thinking?
I do my best thinking in the shower and in the car. Sometimes when I'm out on walks too. It's I think the art of thinking is making space and time in your life to do that, to make it a priority. And, you know, it definitely helps to have an outlet, whether it's your blog, whether you're writing a book, whether you're doing discussions like this or giving talks within your company, to have motivation to think about specific topics, right? But beyond motivation, you need to give yourself the opportunity. And that's where life gets really hard right now, because there's so many things vying for our attention, not just our always present phones and connectedness. We have video games, we have TV, we have friends and family, socializing. There's many, many, many things bombarding us, topics and opportunities to engage with other people and their ideas, that taking time for yourself and giving yourself that space where everything is off. When I go for a walk, I often leave my cell phone at home, much to the chagrin of my spouse, who will try to reach me and realize that he can't. But I do that so that I won't automatically, pick it up every time it buzzes or beeps a notification at me. I do that so that I have that space to just kind of be in my own head. And similarly, when I'm writing, I have an app called Freedom that just blocks all kinds of stuff from my computer, because I realize that I'm twitchy. I'll have a 30-second break and pop over to check on Twitter or Facebook, whatever. And this way it reminds me, no, you're focused, and this is time to be in the present in this particular task and in your head. So yeah, that's I guess that's my art of how I get time to think about the future and come up with creative ideas. I tell my kid all the time, whenever she says she's bored, I'm like, that's when you get your best ideas. Be bored, have time where nothing is demanding your attention, and see where your brain goes.
Wow, Divya, I mean, we've almost eradicated boredom through smartphone apps, and Toon Blast is the latest app that's got me hooked on level 1042 or something. But you're describing a real discipline there, both in terms of implementing those systems to give you that time and space, but also making sure that you're committed to doing it. David, how do you know when to spend time in the company of others bouncing off ideas, and when you just need some David time just to kind of assort and file these things into your mind?
I'm also a fan of taking time by myself, walking, thinking. But I believe that the quality of thoughts that will come to us in these moments do depend on what we've been immersing ourselves in beforehand. So I sometimes say I'm a writer, but more, I think I'm a reader. I make it a habit to figure out which books are truly worth reading. They vary an awful lot. Lots of books have great commendations by friends of the authors, but actually they aren't that great. But I make it my point to try and figure out which books are truly worth reading. And on the basis of reading such books, and I include, by the way, Divya's lovely book, which I read about a couple of weeks ago. And I really liked it because, amongst other things, beyond just mixing up the technological and the human and the politics, it also showed that you can't just think about AI in itself. You have to think about nanotech and biotech and cognitive technologies in parallel, and that actually complicates and enriches the possibilities. So that's an example of a book that I read. I think it's important to have the right provocations in our mind, and then we need our time by ourselves in the shower, sleeping, whilst walking in nature and so on. And that's when ideas come. And also when you start to write, I think it's important to write as well. Maybe just a few slides, and it's in writing these few slides and then thinking about them and then coming back to them that I've made some of my own best breakthroughs.
Thank you, David. That's really helpful just to get to know the two of you a little bit better as well for this conversation. Divya, there's a group of us here today, and we could be set the task. We'd say, okay, think about flying taxis in 2041, and we could probably come up with a pretty good presentation about what that might look like. And then we could go on stage and call ourselves futurists, couldn't we, and talk about flying taxis. That the challenge, of course, is that it's not just that technology that's changing, it's absolutely everything is changing, including the human condition. And it's exponential as well. And this is beyond our human mind, isn't it, to a degree, Divya, to kind of have so many moving parts leading up to a future, let alone a year away, but 20 years away. How do you manage all of that movement?
I think it's not beyond our minds. Honestly, I think human beings have always had the ability to have great foresight and vision beyond their lifetimes. And then it's really a question of what they do with that. In looking at the broader spectrum, I guess it's really kind of looking at all the different facets that affect our lives, whether it's economics, politics, geography, climate, language, family, relationships, communication. I mean, there is a broad list, and I think if you're going to build a world of the future, you need to sit and think about each of those different facets, and then think about how they interconnect. And is it complicated? Yes. That's why, it takes hundreds of pages often to delineate all of these things. But the beauty of narrative is that this also goes back to, the dawn of human history. We've always told stories, and that is a way that we convey information to each other. And that's one of the easiest ways. That's why we tell stories to children. It sticks because you have all this sort of information in the abstract about, AI in 20 years or biotech in 20 years, autonomous vehicles, heads-up devices, anti-gravity boots, if you want to start going, very fanciful into science fiction. But at the end of the day, that's all very abstract. And you're not really rooted in that world until you understand what it's like to be a person in that world. And that's where I think storytelling and narrative is really, really powerful, because it lets you empathize. It lets you walk that metaphorical kilometer in someone else's shoes. And that helps, I think, not only ground you, but helps you understand the information. So rather than a tech person coming in and saying, wow, we can do all this cool stuff, we're going to have quantum computing and it's going to have, all these different levels, and instead of using binary, we get to use a whole different numbering system, you start losing the average person who doesn't have a background, who doesn't know what half of these terms mean. Instead, if I say, oh, your kid's going to get to have a robot teacher that lives in the house and will play blocks with it when you're busy working. And that robot's going to be powered by this thing called quantum computing. And the reason it is that it allows the robot to have far more capability than your laptop and a webcam today. And that's really all the information that they need to then be grounded in that future. And they can start thinking about, oh, wow, like my kids, right? My grandchildren maybe won't be going to a physical school. Maybe it'll be more like the pandemic model, but voluntary and not so bad, because they're going to have this cool individualized robot teacher. So that's where I guess I try to kind of conceptualize, this sort of broad overview of the technical aspects of future worlds. And in fiction, we call it, especially in speculative fiction, we have this term called world building, because whether you're writing, Lord of the Rings or Star Wars, you are defining a world and consistent rules for the people who inhabit that world. And I think futurists do a lot of world building naturally. We think about all the different facets and how human beings are going to move through it. And then the storyteller steps in and helps bring that to a level where we can have a broad understanding and intuitive feel for whether you want to inhabit this world or whether you would like to steer the future in a different direction.
Thank you so much. David, what are the barometers? What are the metrics that we use to say whether the world is better or worse? Some that come to mind, of course, are peace. We certainly are living in the greatest time of peace that we've ever had. Others, obviously, access to opportunity and education and so on. Are they as simple as that, or are they slightly different in terms of how do we know if we've got a better world in 2041?
Well, let me start by painting a picture of 2041. I'll pick up the question that was asked earlier. What's going to be different about Trafalgar Square or New York Times Square? And the picture I'm going to paint, I don't think it's overwhelmingly likely, but I think it's at least 40% likely that something like this will be the case. And in this 40% likely future, I think it'll be clear that this is definitely a step forwards. So the first thing we might notice if we were teleported forwards is that most people seem youthful, fit, healthy, vibrant. And at first we wonder, well, what's happened to the slow people, the old people? Have they been locked up inside? Have they been, heaven forbid, euthanized? And so you talk to people, and it turns out that somebody you thought was 40 is actually 80, and that somebody you thought was in his early 50s is actually 95. And you say, goodness, how is this possible? And they say, don't you know? It was possible by artificial intelligence. And they'll tell a story, which I think is quite a credible story. They'll tell a story that in the 1990s and in the early years of the 21st century, medicine was slowing down. It was more difficult to create new drugs. The cost to take a new drug to market actually escalated. But then from around the early 2020s, significant breakthroughs started happening with the application of AI to medicine. They might talk about the first new antibiotic drug discovered by AI, which was done at MIT last year. MIT looked at the characteristics of antibiotics. They had some deep learning done on this, and they set that program loose on huge amounts of drugs that had been developed for various purposes, but largely had failed. And they found that one that had been trialed for a short while as a diabetes drug was actually potentially a new powerful type of antibiotic. And that seems to be the case. It's now being called Halicin. I could point to the work that In Silico Medicine are doing, led by Alex Zavaronkov, a remarkable person with 3 degrees, lives and works in Hong Kong. He recently had a Series C funding of 255 million. Why? Because his company, In Silico Medicine, is applying methods of artificial intelligence, such as generative adversarial networks, to discover new properties of drugs, existing drugs in new circumstances, and have new treatments. And he has something for idiopathic problem of the digestive system, which normally would have taken years to validate, and he has validated it much more quickly. And that future person might also tell you about arguably the greatest breakthrough in AI in the whole world up to 2021, which was the AlphaFold protein folding work of DeepMind done in London, in which they were able for the first time to take a one-dimensional input, a sequence of genetic basis, and work out to a high degree of probability what the 3-dimensional shape of the resulting protein that was created from that bit of DNA, what it would look like. And this is a remarkable piece of work. It uses data, but it also uses intelligence. It's an example of what I think will be increasingly common, a fusion of the deep learning things that have been so successful in the last 10 years and older style of artificial intelligence. So that's one aspect of a very positive future. And if you bear with me a little bit more, I'll tell you a little bit more about this future, because later you might realize actually the climate looks pretty healthy too. Wasn't initially obvious, but it's a wonderful fresh air. And you ask people, how was this possible? And they'll say, don't you know? It was because of artificial intelligence. They will say people from the 1920s look forward to something called nuclear fusion. From the 1950s onwards, they hoped that nuclear fusion power generation might be 20 years in the future. It never quite worked. It was always too difficult until the 2020s, when 2 things changed. Even in the late 2010s, people were doing things with high temperature semiconductors, which allowed new configurations of fusion plasma generators. And then with artificial intelligence that could take over the design and monitoring of these systems, finally, there was huge amounts of almost free, completely clean energy. And that was how a great transition to green took place. As I say, that's not inevitable. I think such a future is about 40% probable by 2041. And in case some of you say that's far too early, I go back to my experience with smartphones. It was a slow business before it became a fast and furious business. It's been the same with all the industrial revolutions. And I think that the four technologies of the fourth industrial revolution, nanotech, infotech, biotech, and cognitech, they are all accelerating. And by 2041, there is a lot of probability that they will be much more mature than they are today. And I think that will be clearly a desirable future. To answer your original question, Richard, before I pass back the microphone, I would point to the social progress indicator. It's a remarkable piece of work that's been done by a nonprofit, which measures a whole range of social indications, such as access to information, access to social rights, equality, and lack of fear. I mean, if you measure that people are fearful, if they are distressed, that makes that indicator go down. I think that's a great indicator to balance an over-reliance on the GDP, which has bedeviled a lot of our politics and economics for the last 40 years or so.
David, thank you so much. So much in there that you've talked about. We do stand on the shoulders of giants, don't we? And ever since writing books and building libraries, and if we have this kind of free energy, surplus of energies, then it makes you wonder what could be, what would be on the shoulders of that if that was available, clean, green, and in surplus supply. Divya, well, with you again, if we may. The book is set in 2095, but one thing you told me in our discussions leading up to the event is that you were tracking the progress decade by decade as you work towards 2095. Can you share a little bit about what your planning looked like at the 2041 point?
Sure. The 2020s that I envisioned about 4 years ago reflected a lot of what Helen was saying in terms of the rise of autonomous machines. So we've seen this burgeoning in the AI industry in terms of software the past 10, 15 years. I think what we're going to see in the next decade is hardware and robotics. The ways in which intelligent machines and adaptive machines will interact with the world, the physical world, and with us as human beings. And in parallel, as David was saying, nanotech and biotech, further understandings of the human genome and improvements in gene editing, which are happening very, very quickly. So then by the 2030s, I think the reaction to this, I'm less optimistic about political, corporate, and social will to affect the level of change that David so wonderfully described. And I think we will see a massive recession. We will see potential impacts to the labor markets. Biotech is going to hopefully start to alleviate that as more people get the appropriate education to work in that particular sector, because it will be growing. So you'll have, certain areas that are shrinking, other areas that are growing, and in those transition times, that's when we see turbulence in, economics and the labor market. For more fun stuff, I was thinking that by the 2030s, we will hopefully start seeing the first brain machine and brain computer interfaces that we can embed into ourselves, into our bodies. So in 2041, I'm hoping that people won't be walking around staring at their phones or at their hands, literally, that instead they will be walking around staring somewhat blankly into the space in front of them, twitching their hands and using various gestures to interact with their devices, which will still be devices on their person. However, some of it is just, much like we're seeing with, the AirPods and the wireless earphones, we're going to have wireless cameras that we can probably just stick on like Band-Aids onto various parts of our body. We may start seeing significantly more reduction in size and prevalence of drones to do that. So one of the fun things in the book that horrifies a lot of people is an extension of the always-on social media culture in which you can have a swarm of micro-drone cameras following you around and you're the star of your own movie all the time, and that's public. I think we might see the rudiments of that in the coming decades, and so that's where I expect we'll probably be. And you know, the one thing we haven't talked too much about that is going to throw an even bigger wrench into all of this is climate change, and all of this automation, all of the compute power, the data centers that drive all of these things are already having an impact on our climate. And while there are sustainable energy solutions, it comes back to, do we have the will to go there? There's news today that, you know, was it the US, China, and I forget who the third country was, are all doubling down on fossil fuels for the next decade, when they really should be doing the opposite. There's another bit of news I saw pretty recently that the tax system in America could be fully automated, where human beings don't have to sit and file taxes and do all the paperwork and calculations, even if it's on the computer, that it could be 100% automated. Your tax bill just comes to you, you can review it and say, yes, I agree, here's my money, or, you know, no, I don't, and then that goes off to a different channel. The reason we didn't do that is because the tax preparation industry, software, and, you know, corporations where other people do your taxes, lobbied the government not to have this easy automated way of doing things. So while we do have all this wonderful technology coming up, I do question, you know, how quickly we will adopt it when we're kind of constantly facing this friction of vested interests. And change will come, it always does, but it may be a lot slower than we want, and in which case climate impacts may additionally either slow down or exacerbate the digital divide and access to the benefits that automation and education will provide.
Well, I agree. I see that there are significant scenarios ahead. I offered quite a positive one for 20 years out, which I said had about a 40% chance of coming true. But there's at least a 20% chance that in 20 years' time we'll be in a far worse situation than we are today. We will have failed to tackle climate change. Weather will be much worse. There will be all kinds of people migrating from country to country and fighting their way around walls that have been erected in their place. And as Robin Rowe pointed out in a good comment in the chat, he said, in some countries in the world, we have seen a declining life expectancy. And this is even before COVID. There is growths of deaths of despair. So unless we are tackling these things, we will probably not be able to take full advantage of the wonderful possibilities of technology. And the difference is going to come down to humans. The difference is going to come down to whether we can see clearly enough, realistically credible opportunities, whether we avoid being distracted, whether we're able to form the right coalitions, whether we're able to identify the landmines that we need to avoid and be bold and strong, which is why we need these conversations all the time, every day of the week, reaching out to bring more and more people out of thinking small thoughts, even though they're exciting and fun, and into thinking about the truly enormous possibilities of much better, but also much worse futures that could come all too quickly.
Absolutely. I think David and Divya, brilliant points in the chat. You can see people are really intrigued and they want to really know more. Divya, from perspective of what vision you have from 2041, you mentioned about genetic engineering and biotech. So what changes will it bring to the human life, we think, with genetic engineering coming into picture? Sorry, was I audible? I don't know. I
Yeah,
just,
you were very
Just
faint, but I heard you.
yeah.
So genetic engineering.
can you repeat the question, Divya, just because some of us did struggle a little bit to hear it?
Yeah, sure. I'll just repeat the question. So I said that as per her vision for 2041, we mentioned about biotech and genetic engineering, which many people may not be even aware of, that something like that is being planned. So how do we see an impact to the human life from that perspective, I would say?
Yeah, so the impacts are potentially vast from genetic engineering. What the stage we are right now, from what I understand, is we kind of have two pieces of the puzzle. On one side, we are, decoding genomes. We're trying to understand what individual genes do, how they are regulated, how epigenetics affects genetic expression within different bodies. And on the other side, we have the engineering piece. How can we assemble DNA or RNA from the building blocks of amino acids? How can we go in and target specific genes and either, control the switches that regulate their expression, or even replace those genes effectively and safely? And as these two pieces converge, eventually, we're going to get to the point where the what's the best word? The sort of the favorite boogeyman of genetic engineering, which is designer babies, right? That's going to become a possibility, and people are starting to think about the ethics of that. But I think it goes far beyond the question of how and should we design our babies to how and should we design all the living organisms in our entire ecosystem, and in what way can we do it that will be safe and potentially effective. We are going through a mass extinction right now of life, and we're losing that diversity. And while we could gradually recreate and repopulate, we have lost information along the way. So can we do better than we are right now in terms of genetically modifying into monocultures to kind of take that genetic modification capability and genetic engineering to actually diversify food, to make ourselves more resilient, to bring back insects and animals that help heal the environment, that promote forest growth. All of these things are so interconnected, right? And so I think there's a potential, again, for sort of a vast new industry built around this capability, just like there was with first, as Helen said, with steam, then with electricity, then with semiconductors, now with intelligent software, next with genetic engineering, to a level to which we haven't had the capability or the know-how until I think that's probably more 30 or 40 years, maybe even 50 years out. But it has the potential, again, to create an entire new economy of its own, where people are designing not just babies and crops, but designing vaccines, designing ways to, for David's point, live longer, healthier lives, building, organ replacements from your own tissue, revitalizing the body, all of these things. And hopefully in the process, considering how to revitalize trees, how to create more sustainable ecosystems that we can live in, to perhaps find new plants and animals that can thrive in the climate that is basically inevitable by the end of this century.
I think these are the important points that you raised, and in context to that, I would like to move this a little, because genetic engineering and drug discovery, they go all in the healthcare world. And David, I would like to raise one of the questions that came on the chat, and it's quite interesting that Henry has raised. If medicine improved dramatically, then what happens to the world population and all the effects on the planet that will entail? I think I'm also interested to know about it, and it's an interesting question. And then we can bring in all the panelists for the third fireside chat.
It's a great question. And the good news is that it has been discussed at length in the futurist and transhumanist communities. The first answer is that the Earth could sustain a significantly larger population than today, provided we stop killing animals for meat, which takes a large part of the planet. So this is one of the progress we could have from the genetic engineering and AI that SB Divya was just talking about. We already have some experiments with cultivated meat. I think that's the preferred term now. Sometimes it was called clean meat or lab-grown meat, but cultivated meat. And once this is possible, I think we can recover large parts of the land, which are given over to growing protein as plants so that animals can eat it, and then we can slaughter the sentient animals. That's wrong in so many ways. It's wrong because of the destruction of sentient life. It's wrong because it's an inefficient use of land. It's wrong because it's a very wasteful use of water and pesticides, and it emits lots of greenhouse gases. So if we accelerate synthetic meat, I think we can see all kinds of benefits. The meat will be healthier as well, by the way. It won't have hormones corrupting it and so forth. So that's just part of the answer. I think the population will grow. It won't grow so rapidly, but it will grow. And in due course, we don't need to hurry, but in about 100 years' time, there will be space satellites, and there will be movement into outer space. But before then, we can just grow larger skyscrapers, ecologically friendly and beautiful skyscrapers using nanotechnology. So we can cope with many more people on the planet. The thing that's harder to cope with is if we are still living in a wasteful and a dirty and a polluting way. That is the more urgent thing. It's not the population itself. It is how carbon intense is our energy use and how good are we at recycling. And again, I say AI can be part of the solution there, not just nuclear fusion, which is what I threw out as one possibility earlier, but with accelerating next generation solar panels, even better than we have today, and very importantly, with extracting carbon and other greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. AI, together with new materials and together with genetic engineering, there are possibilities to accelerate. That is called negative emissions technologies. They are not commercially viable today, but with sufficient investment, sufficient research, I think they can become meaningful. So that's what I would like to see happen, and we can have a much larger population, and in due course, we will go into space, into the solar system, and even into new whole universes.
Amazing. I think, Richard, time is never enough. I can listen to this panel the whole day. And it's getting really more interesting, especially from points that have been raised now. But we would have to move to the next session about the ethical considerations that we need to have around this for 2041 being more positive.